This is Thursday, the 28th of April, 2022. Welcome to IQI, or Inconvenient Questions International. I'm your host, Vishwa Sadashivan from Singapore. IQ is committed to fostering deeper understanding, empathy, involvement through open-minded, informed conversations across boundaries. We believe that awareness is the first step towards action. Today is part 2 of our effort to better understand the situation in Ukraine. Some people have asked why IQI is choosing to spend so much time on Ukraine, as if it's the only place where people are suffering or have suffered. I have been asked these questions. Some even ask if Ukraine is special because it's a white country. My response is simple. Just because humanity may not have paid enough attention to other crises or war situations before, it doesn't mean we make the same mistake here. It has become a full-fledged war, Ukraine, where lives are being lost or displaced every day. Even if we aren't in a position to help, at least we must show interest. The debate on who is to blame for the crisis is ongoing. Talking about it is not going to get us anywhere, at least in the next 1.5 hours. So today we will focus on this question. How can we end the fighting and address the humanitarian tragedy in Ukraine and the impact on the rest of the world? The topic is Ukraine, impact and recovery. There's nothing like seeing the tragedy through pictures. The photographs you're going to be seeing in a short while are taken by an international humanitarian photographer, Matthias Heng. Hi, Matthias. Welcome on to IQ International. Matthias is a Singaporean who's present in Ukraine, and he's talking to us live from there. He's kindly agreed to share his observations and feelings as we bring you the photographs. Could we please show the pictures now? Matthias, go ahead. Speak.
Well, this photo was taken. I think we run through the slides and I'll explain later. That's the mortuary in Bucha. And this is all the mass grave to clean the bodies for investigation. And this coffin was exhumed for further investigation. And this is the Epping Cemetery. Every day, there are bodies coming in for burial. This man, he died of COVID due to underground shelter. There was no medical help. This was in the underground shelter where children, I suspect, are traumatized by the shelling.
That was quite painful to even watch from here. What were some of your experiences in the past 2 months, Matthias? I mean, this is the first time. This is the first time you've been to Ukraine, I believe.
Yes, my first time been to Ukraine. I came to Ukraine I was supposed to come on the 22nd of February. So when I booked my flight, of course, all flights were canceled. So I had to use a longer route. So I went by Poland. From Poland, I crossed the border by bus, went to Lviv, then by train to Kiev. So the whole journey took me about 36 hours just to get into Kiev. But during that period of time, I saw the whole ordeal of the refugees or displaced Ukrainians were crossing the border, and the queue of getting to Poland will take them about 60 hours on average during that period of time. Invasion, when Russia invaded Ukraine. So of course I was going in, everybody's going out. So going in was much easier, but I could see the whole stretch of a row of cars, was just waiting to cross the border. It was like a stretch of like 5 kilometers.
You were sharing earlier, Matthias, that they initially the Russian soldiers used to shoot on the kneecap.
Yes. So during the invasion, when Russian troops, when they go into Epping and Bucha, and they've got different battalions, so all different groups. But not forgetting that they've got different ethnic groups. They got the Russian army, they got the Chechen fighters, and different ethnic groups as well. So all depends on the locals, on the civilians, on what sort of soldiers they met. So the unfortunate ones that happen to meet the ones that are more brutal. So when the captured men, first thing they shoot on their kneecap, and then they start asking them questions. Whereas I've been to other streets whereby the Russian soldiers treat them humanely, inhumane. They ask them questions and ask them whether they've got weapons in their homes, and of course they search out their homes. And there are cases whereby there's another case, another incident that I met a family that Russian army came in, started questioning the man, and the Russian doctor came in and started telling the men, saying that, okay, I'm going to check your finger. I'll see whether you're a soldier or not. So what they do, they will feel your finger. Your finger is really rough. They know that you've been shooting. So they'll cut your finger off. So there's one way of interrogation and asking, they want to get information. And of course, a lot of homes that were used as Russian-based. Russian lived there. They use as interrogation room as well. Especially they use the underground storage, whereby Ukrainians they store their food during winter. So they use that as interrogation room and torture room as well.
So Matthias, if I may ask you, what would be the most powerful emotion that you felt, and why and when?
I felt mainly deeply for the civilians, and because they were helpless. I witnessed, thousands of them, evacuating from Bucha, Epping, when the bridge, Ukrainian army had to destroy the bridge, preventing the Russian from coming in. So, one way of evacuating was to cross under the bridge and through waters, and they were using makeshift bridge with plywoods, planks, and people with wheelchair, with stretcher, and they were going through in the cold. And last month it was extremely cold. It was winter. It was snowing. So and everybody of all ages were traumatized.
Yeah.
And I saw, like, I witnessed, like, elderly people as old as 90 years old, going through such pain. And I even met people that who were involved, who were in Crimea, in Donbass, in 2014. They left to a safer place, came to Kyiv, and this is happening to
Then
them
this
again.
happened, yeah. And actually, this would be a good time for us to, welcome another panelist. She's the president of the Ukrainian Club in Singapore, Dr. Galina Kogut. Galina, I couldn't help noticing that you were pretty emotional when the photographs were being shown. Could you join us to share some of your thoughts and feelings? I believe your relatives and family are still there.
Right. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to say something now, because yes, to be honest, it's 2 months, it's over 2 months now, it's 64 days, and we're really counting by days, no matter where you are. If you are a Ukrainian, you just take it very personally. And I understand that for those people who live now in Ukraine and have to suffer through that, that is absolutely hard. But we also don't, we are not aloof with all of that, and it's just going through all of our souls. Because when I was looking through those buildings, these are the kind of buildings we are living in. These are the kind of buildings which I used to see since I was born, and the roads, it was just absolutely horrible to watch on the news. Like, the whole world was watching online how, like in some computer game, somebody blasts and the whole house is just gone, and the house with the people. And I feel very bad for my parents, because they are the war and post-war generation. So they had to witness that, of course, from the German side. But my grandparents, I sort of like, it's throughout our lives. Like, we had the atrocities. My family, my mother's family, they used to live in the territories which were after the Second World War, which were given to another country. So they had to be evacuated, also chased out of their own homes, like what is happening now in Ukraine. And we do have the encounters in our family from the Russian soldiers who literally was beating my granddad, and then he died after some time because of that. And all small children, like my parents, were witnessing all that. So I kind of know how bad they can go. But when the war started this time, until the last moment, I was hoping that maybe it's some kind of a bad dream, but it's not. So, and when you look at things just being ruined, and all my family is there. So what Ukrainians are trying to do is to save their children. They're bringing them overseas to the neighboring countries, because the children is the future of the country. All my elders in my family, they are staying, just suffering through that, trying to follow the rule of the two walls, because some of them are so old they can't move up and down, even to those cellars which are designed like basically every high-rise in Ukraine, they would have some kind of a cellar downstairs. So my parents can't do that. So they just have to follow the rule of the two walls. And recently I was talking to them, and the Russians were bombing some strategic objects. But in 2 months, we already know that by bombing strategic objects, they can just bomb anywhere. And don't really care. So they just shoot anywhere. So those buildings in Kyiv and pretty much all those, we call them panel built buildings, like they're made of pieces and bricks pre-made. During the USSR times, during Khrushchev times, they had to build it very quickly. So all these they're still there. So I've seen that every day. And now,
you see, Galina and Matthias as well. What I guess I'm quite troubled by is I've had people talk to me and tell me that President Zelensky is to blame for this, because you could have just surrendered. You could have just given up the land and saved lives. I have learned people, Singaporeans as well as people in the region, who tell me this is the Ukrainians' fault for allowing this to happen, this carnage to happen. If you had actually given up, you would have saved lives.
Well, I
How would you
disagree.
respond? Yeah.
Because if President Zelensky, he was given the option to evacuate. If he did, Ukraine today will be under Russian. And that's what the Russian, that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to take over Kyiv. And if they did that, and then the whole of Ukraine will collapse. So, so what Ukrainian President Zelensky did, I think he fought for the country. So if he left, I strongly believe Ukraine will collapse, because
yeah, and I guess the question that's coming, the basis of the questions from these people who are saying these things is that what price you pay for keeping people alive, and they are saying, why is it so important? Sovereignty.
Sovereignty is,
Galina.
of course, is their country.
Yeah, but I want to hear it.
Yeah.
What's your response to them?
Matthias, I guess you just nailed it. Sovereignty is the country. If you don't have that, you don't have the country, and then you don't know who you are. And then I've been repeating this again and again, and it's about your identity. It's about who you are. Do they really think that if Russians came there without first of all, I'm a Ukrainian, and I know that Ukraine has been fighting with Russia for many centuries. I've studied the history. I've seen it throughout my own life. I've lived through the USSR invasion of, technically this is the empire or a wannabe empire, which has been changing names throughout the history. So during the USSR, it was mainly Russia who was going around conquering the countries. You just look at Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, how much they're putting resistance, how much they don't want to go back there, and they can't even think about the thought, So to me, first of all, Ukrainians, I can't imagine Ukrainians not fighting. I just can't. It's absolutely against our identity. And that's exactly the reason why Russia wants to conquer Ukraine so badly. Then you imagine this. The invaders came. Do people really think that they will spare anyone? We are still a sovereign, independent country, and they're already shooting civilians, killing everyone they can see. So if they are there to decide on the people's fate, do you think they spare anyone? No, they don't. We all know gulags, we all know Holodomor, we all know all sort of other genocide. Those who are intelligent, those who question things, those who think critically, they will know. And the last thing in my argument is, when the woman is raped, why doesn't she just lie there and enjoy? What kind of argument is this? She starts punching and beating and defending herself. That's normal. She can't just lie there and enjoy. It's absolutely out of the question. So yeah, this is just my thoughts, about that.
No, it's wonderful. I hope you understand why I raised this, because even as we speak, not everybody is convinced, that that the Ukrainians should actually dig in your heels and fight. I think it's very important that we hear it from a Ukrainian, as well as someone who is a non-Ukrainian who's been there, like you, Matthias. Nobody's right or wrong here. People have to make choices, and you've just explained the reason for your choice. This is probably a good time for us to talk about the UN Secretary General's recent visit to Moscow. Right, a few days ago, he was there and he met with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, as well as President Putin. He made a few major announcements. 8.3 million Ukrainians will flee the country, he said. He proposed the establishment of a humanitarian contact group, bringing together representatives from Russia, Ukraine, and the UN to look, quote, for opportunities for the opening of safe corridors to evacuate civilians. He also said that thousands of civilians are in dire need of life-saving humanitarian assistance and many of evacuation. The United Nations, he says, is ready to fully mobilize its human and logistical resources to help save lives, in particular in Mariupol. Secretary General Guterres also proposed a coordinated work with the Red Cross to allow people holed up inside the city, at city's steel plant. It's estimated that hundreds of Ukrainian fighters and some 1,000 over civilians are currently taking cover in underground tunnels in the steel plant. And I'm talking about the Azovstal steel plant. And videos have emerged showing Ukrainians pleading for help and pleading for mercy as they continue to face bombardment from Russian forces in Mariupol. More than 430,000 people used to live in Mariupol, and now it's nearly 100,000 from what I've understood. There's hardly any food or water, and it's from what I understand, it's extremely hot in there. Ukrainian authorities estimate that more than 20,000 civilians have been killed in Mariupol. Recent satellite images showed what appeared to be mass graves, something that Matthias, you mentioned just now. The Russian Defense Ministry, on the other hand, agreed to a ceasefire on the 25th, a few days ago, to let children and women leave the steel plant. But there's fear that these corridors aren't safe, as Russian forces had fired upon other corridors before in other parts of Ukraine. The Russian government has, on their part, condemned Ukrainian troops for using unarmed civilians as human shields. So this sort of arguments continue while people suffer and die. All these have made the work of humanitarian agencies very tough and risky. So what are some of the specific challenges that these humanitarian agencies like the International Red Cross face? We have with us the Secretary General and the CEO of the Singapore Red Cross, Benjamin William. Ben, welcome aboard. Could you share with us what challenges your colleagues are facing on the ground and the nature of the relationship the Red Cross is likely to have with the UN, as announced by Secretary General Guterres? Ben? You're muted.
Yeah. Thank you, Viswa, for having me on the panel. First of all, let me comment on the Secretary General Guterres' statement in Moscow. I think the Red Cross has been deeply concerned about the situation in Mariupol. As you pointed out, the population is in very dire need of assistance. And in fact, we've called for immediate and unimpeded humanitarian access, which is urgently required to allow for the voluntary safe passage of thousands of civilians as well as the wounded who are within Mariupol, including the ones in the Azovstal plant area. So the Red Cross will continually and repeatedly call for these safe passages. It is going to be a complex situation. You know, as you correctly point out, that in the past, where some of these safe corridors have been declared, there has been nevertheless been shooting at the people using the corridor. So it is understandable that the Ukraine side want to have further assurance before you accept that there is a safe corridor, and it's been accepted by the Russian side, as Secretary General Guterres seemed to imply. I think as far as the Red Cross is concerned with regard to safe corridors, that is one of the priorities of the Red Cross, being a neutral, non-political organization. It is to ensure the safety of civilians and the wounded in conflicts. So we will continue to work with the UN. We will continue to talk to the parties involved in the conflict to ensure the safety of civilians and the working of a safe corridor, whether in Mariupol or elsewhere. But this is not the only challenge that the Red Cross movement is facing on the ground. That is just one part of the work of the Red Cross in a conflict situation. You know, the military offense has really led to a tremendous crisis, which is a human rights crisis as well as a humanitarian crisis. we now estimate that more than 20 million people will require assistance within Ukraine. That's more than half the population, actually. And about 16 million or so within the country. And many because of the massive destruction, massive destruction of civilian infrastructure, right? We find clinics that have been destroyed. We find hospitals that have been destroyed. We know about the children's hospital, how badly that's been damaged, and the damage continues. But likewise, you have the 5 million or so more now, people who have left the country. And, these are in the refugee centers. Now, of course, the immediate need in the refugee centers is the shelter, is the food and the water. But we are also now coming to realize as we interact with
sorry, when you say refugee centers, just for audience to understand, you're talking about outside of Ukraine, right?
Outside of Ukraine.
You're not talking about taking care of internally displaced people.
The internally displaced persons, as I mentioned, one estimate is that there are as many as about 15+ million people within Ukraine
who had to flee from their homes.
Yeah, who are
but
displaced.
They're still within Ukraine.
Within Ukraine, yeah. So another 5 to 5.5 million people have crossed the borders to the neighboring countries. So the Red Cross movement in Poland, in Hungary, in some of the other neighboring countries have been actively working with the displaced people who have come into the country. Now there, the challenges are as great. Sure, there's the immediate needs like the shelter and the food and the water. But we are also finding that there are many of these displaced persons with chronic illnesses, with very specific needs, both within Ukraine as well as outside Ukraine, rare diseases that needs to be handled, but now they do not have access to the medicines. And one area where we see an increasing need is psychosocial support, especially among the children.
Yeah.
Right. One estimate is that among those people who have left the country, about 80 to 90% are women and children.
Yeah.
And you can imagine the needs of the children who have been displaced, who have lost their families.
Because the men have stayed back to fight.
So in fact, one of the areas that Singapore Red Cross is actually looking in our next tranche of help is to send teams to do psychosocial support programs for the children, where we see a growing need. So I think these are some of the challenges we face on the ground. In a conflict situation, it's much more complicated than a disaster in a natural disaster.
Natural disaster.
Natural disaster happens 2-3 days, and then you move into do relief operations and then the rebuilding and recovery. But this is a conflict that is ongoing now for more than 2 months. We don't see it coming to an end. So the relief phase will go on for a long time. You have to take care of the basic needs, food, water. The Ukrainian Red Cross alone has already dispersed as much as about 6,000 tons of basic necessities. And that's just the Ukraine Red Cross working, supported by organizations like Singapore Red Cross. So that will go on. So the challenge in a conflict zone is also you have to deal with conflicting parties, right? And so you talk, Matthias was talking about getting shot on the street if you go to help someone. So these are real issues that we have to deal with. I'll give you one last anecdote and then I will yield the floor. We have been working actually with Dr. Galina's colleague on getting first aid kits into Ukraine. And the rationale is very simple. With so many people injured, whether mild injuries or life-threatening injuries, you cannot depend on sending them into clinics and hospitals because they don't exist. So the best way is to get a group of paramedics, collect these first aid kits from Poland, from a warehouse in Poland, and bring them into Ukraine and distribute it among paramedics who will be able to treat those who are injured. And these are some of the complications and complex situations that we are facing on the ground.
Galina, would you like to respond to what Ben just said about working with the Red Cross? You're muted. Yeah.
Yes, we are very grateful to Mr. Benjamin that you agreed to help with that, because that's really an issue for on the ground there. with all those wounded and at the, you know, there's like millions of civilians suffering now. So yeah, we do have a colleague who is working directly with, I mean, she's also the member of our club. She's working directly with Mr. Benjamin on doing that. So that's an immensely important thing to do. And then we are just trying to look out into other opportunities and into other things, other necessities which the Red Cross can actually assist with, where exactly they're on the ground with the medicines, probably for some rare diseases and other areas like that. So I think the cooperation coordination now is ongoing.
Yeah, the cooperation coordination is so important, and also, you know, people misreading intentions, you know, you may have the best intention when you go in, but it doesn't mean that people on the ground will necessarily trust you, because there's so much of trust deficit going on, especially in war situations like this. In fact, the same thing I believe happened to UN Secretary General. You know, there was a lot of unhappiness about him meeting with the Russian leaders. And that's why I believe he made it very clear when he was in Moscow that he was a messenger of peace. And his quote, he actually said this. He said, "It is my deep conviction that the sooner we end this war, the better for the people of Ukraine, for the people of Russian Federation, and those far beyond. That includes us in Singapore." The World Bank estimates that about 37% is the number in terms of the expected increase in food prices worldwide. So it's not just the war per se, it's how this is affecting the rest of the world, right? Economically and in terms of food. And it is described as a human catastrophe, you know, by the World Bank. Supply chains have been affected at unprecedented levels. It will clearly take a while to recover, given the triple whammy of, you know, we're just coming out of COVID-19 pandemic, the war happens, and at the same time, you know, the multiple lockdowns in China, especially in ports like Shanghai. All of these things have a serious effect on global supply chain, right? And this in turn will affect clearly business certainty and confidence. And there are serious concerns of inflation and possibly even stagflation. There's an urgent need to end this war. Very clearly, there's an urgent need on all counts to end the war. And I believe that's the reason why the Secretary General of the UN is in Moscow and subsequently in Kiev. In ending the war, in not making it sustainable, a key strategy has been the imposition of prohibitive economic sanctions against Russia. This includes banning Russian banks from SWIFT, which is an acronym for Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications, a vast messaging network for banks and other financial institutions for effective money transactions. The New Yorker described this as a financial nuclear weapon. Well, on the one hand, this appears to have affected Russia and Russians, from the mighty oligarchs to the farmers to the vast Russian diaspora. On the other hand, it could force Russia to go to alternative, unregulated financial transactions. Also, that it could affect European countries, especially, and cripple supply chains. So how effective are these economic sanctions? That's a big question that a lot of people are asking. I would like to put this to our fourth panelist, Dr. Timur Beg. He's the chief economist of DBS Bank. Timur, welcome aboard.
Thank you, Vishwa. It's a pleasure to be here.
Please share your views about how effective these economic sanctions have been, will continue to be, even if they increase.
Sanctions have their place in the toolkit to deal with aggression, but they are not a panacea in solving the issue of aggression. If you look at the history of sanction, whether it was a decades-long worldwide effort to isolate South Africa, or the US-led sanctions against Iraq and Iran through the 90s and 2000s, or for that matter, half a century of sanctions by the US on Cuba, none of those have really been instrumental in toppling regimes or to create a massive change in the direction or the trajectory of the regime in place. It's painful. But as you already alluded to, there are ways to circumvent those pain, depending on how convoluted a measure one wants to take. And right now, of course, we're not even talking about foolproof sanctions. Europe alone makes several $100 million worth of payments to Russia every day, right? Every day. 2
oil and
billion
gas.
barrels of refined fuel and 1 million barrel of crude petroleum. And even if tomorrow all of that were to be stopped from importation into Europe, that doesn't mean the China's, India's, and others would not be buying them at substantial discount. So in effect, giving a way out for Russia. Now, you could also argue that it will not be a one-for-one match. There are certain specificities associated with Russian exports of gas and fuel that will lend itself to be compressed, even if there were alternative buyers. And of course, the alternative buyers themselves have their own capacity constraints, depending on the sulfur content in the fuel that is being imported, depending on the refinery's capacity to refine the Russian grade oil versus the other ones that those countries are used to importing. So it's not that straightforward. There will be some net pain for Russia. Already the forecast is for Russia's economy to contract by about 8.5% this year. Of course, nothing compared to what we're looking at Ukraine, which is about 35% decline in GDP. But it will be nonetheless painful, but it would not be, at least looking at history, effective in regime change or fundamental change.
Altering behavior.
That's correct.
Or even altering behavior.
Now, that doesn't mean that we've sort of run out of tools to add further pressure on Russia. So the chief economist of the Institute of International Finance, Robin Brooks, just posted yesterday that one way to discourage alternative importers of Russian commodities is to sort of start getting in the way of insuring tankers that take that product from Russia to elsewhere. So the worldwide system of insurance is also something that is intermediated largely through Western financial institutions. And if that were to go away, then of course, a lot of the tankers who are right now taking things from Russia to elsewhere would have second thoughts. So my point is that sanctions hurt. There are ways to ramp up the sanctions, but as long as Europe's energy dependence is substantial, as long as the Chinese and the Indians are keen importers of Russian energy, it will not be super effective in inflicting the kind of pain that I suppose the West wants to inflict on Ukraine.
Actually,
on Russia.
The Brookings Institute cautions against the sanctions or increasing the sanctions broad-based. Because they suggest that it could backfire, for example, by emboldening authoritarian regimes such as Putin's. And there's a logic to that. You have to look at the profile of the man who is waging war. Is he driven by, what's he driven by? Is it ego? Is it power? Does he really care about the plight of the Russian people and the diaspora? Or is he hell-bent on making a point, fists clenched? These are questions that we need to ask, even as we punch forward with sanctions and other tools from the toolkit, as you said. So how important is it for us to also consider the possibility of these actions backfiring because you're dealing with a man who is not necessarily acting rationally?
I think the cool, hard calculation is the following. Would Russian homes suffer from lack of heat in the coming winter? The answer is no, because Russia is self-sufficient on energy. Would they run out of food? And the answer is largely no. Would they run out of fancy Mercedes and iPads and Campbell soup? Yes, but I think that's not the kind of pain that leads to a seismic shift in one's policy action. So, which is why I also think that the specific attributes of the Russian economy is such that there is a limited amount of effectiveness that one can have on sanctions. I do think that the Western perspective on sanctions is the following, that the people around the upper echelons of the Russian regime are used to Western-centric lifestyle, have parked a lot of their wealth in the West, and as their punch bowl is taken away, they may then impart indirect pressure on the decision makers in Russia that this is going too far. I am skeptical of that mode of thinking. I think that at a crisis moment like this, the luxuries that the oligarchs are used to and that being taken away, I don't think is of first or second order importance as far as Putin's decision making is concerned. And hence, what might seem like very draconian from our perspective, from a war-waging nation, I don't think it would be seen as prohibitive, or it would be seen as cost totally worth paying. So, which is why I think that there's a limit of how far sanctions can go in terms of changing the minds of the Russians.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. We've heard from all four of our panelists, and at this point, I'd like to introduce our three youth panelists for this discussion. We would like to ensure that that we don't miss out on hearing what our young people from around the world feel about what's happening in Ukraine. So we have Eliza Shafika from Malaysia. Hi, Eliza.
Hi, can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Right.
Thank you. We have Mike Nkombo Kunga from Malawi. Hi, Mike.
Hi. Hi. Hi.
Hi. And we have Santiago Cali from Colombia. Hi, Santiago.
Hi, how are you?
Hi. I would like to hear your comments, and please feel free to put your comments to the panelists, all of them, or any specific member. What are your perspectives of what's going on?
I think I can go first.
Please go ahead,
perhaps.
Liza.
All right, so I'm from Malaysia, and I think when it comes to this, although because in Malaysia, per se, like in ASEAN, our primary focus right now is more concern of COVID. So there was, I recently read about 2 days ago, there was an article written that whether the perceptions of the Ukraine and the Russian war have anything to do with us. So unfortunately, a lot of the so-called Malaysians seem to not really bother much by the war. But I don't think that's the true perception. We are actually, I would say, internalizing. We have like this type of fear of what will happen. Because I think at the first start of the war, I would say it does not seem to impact us that much. So we see it as like, for instance, Malaysia, right? We are quite far from Ukraine or Russia. So the impacts might not be seen. But once we see how the war escalated, how does that start to affect on our military, on our trades? And more so, it then feels that feeling of fear starts to impose to us. So I think what youth can actually see is that this situation that is happening in Ukraine can be actually replicated to our nearby states. In the case of Malaysia, Sabah has been one of our, I would say, very precious state that we really would just love to continue and work under Malaysia. But due to historical ties, the Philippines has always been claiming that Sabah is always a part of them. So in this case, it might be replicated. And if we go beyond Malaysia, I think there are a lot of scholars trying to say and put, I would say, a correlation that to a certain extent, China might do that towards Taiwan and Hong Kong. So all of us not only feel scared, but we need to, at the same time, we need to also remain open to what will be lies.
So I have a quick question, Eliza. Yes. What are your thoughts? I mean, apart from this, the possibility of this replicating in your context in Malaysia, what are your thoughts about what is happening?
All right.
Even though it's thousands of miles away, what are your thoughts about what's happening?
I think it's something that all of us see. To a certain extent, we can resonate how it feels. Because like none of us would like to see a war emerge. None of us would like to say, I think Mr. Benjamin put it really well. It's like all of them are facing psychosocial impacts. And a lot of them are fleeing from Ukraine to nearby countries. And I think all of us don't want to have that type of feeling. Because why should we be having that feeling when, in this case, Ukraine is a sovereign country and they should have that level of protection towards its citizens. So most of us view this as something as, to a certain extent, it's actually not even to a certain extent. It is actually inhumane. So
Yeah.
even Malaysia has went up to like a multilateral scape to actually voice out that we are not okay with this type of aggression taking place. We
Right.
want Russia to actually ensure that these type of things to stop and follow the international humanitarian law. So we have, on a personal basis, my organization, which I led, My Diplomacy, have been working closely with the Malaysian youth and also the Malaysian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to combat this situation. So what we propose is to actually have Malaysia to voice out in the United Nations General Assembly, and also because we are also a part of the United Nations Human Rights Council, to ensure that these type of things are being voiced out. Because
Right.
at the end of the day, as I mentioned, there are limited things that we could actually do. Because I mean, like for youth, us, we don't really have much power. We can't
Okay.
go and straight away and say, all of the officials, please stop and withdraw all your troops. I don't think we have that capacity. But what we
Right.
can do is that we use our government officials of the day to actually go and have diplomatic talks and try our best to have like a ceasefire or even to resolve the situation at its best.
Right. Thank you very much, Eliza. Mike and Santiago, anything to add?
Yes,
Mike?
maybe if I can come in before
Please.
Santiago.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, just to really explain the impact of the war, especially when it comes to economy in the sub-Saharan region. So at first, when the war started, for example, the price of bread, and especially, let me just also say that as the sub-Saharan region, 85% of wheat is being imported from Russia and Ukraine.
And wheat is your staple food, right? Is your main food?
It's not necessarily main food, but I think most Malawians and most people in the sub-Saharan region really depend on bread and other products from wheat. So because of the impact of the war and the like, we have seen that bread, which is highly consumed in my country, recently has risen from 50 cents to $1.20, which is quite huge for the poor populations to really afford. But when we also look at in terms of production, we are a country that really depends on agriculture, and we usually use fertilizer as inputs. And the price of fertilizer in my country has doubled because we usually depend on input from Russia and Ukraine. So this is just to give a snapshot in terms of how the war has brought in terms of the impact in terms of the economy, especially in countries within the sub-Saharan region. And for your own information, most of the countries, as you know, we're just probably bouncing back from COVID-19, and which has really disrupted our food systems, our capacity, and our production. And because of the war, our policies are not well shaped in place to really probably move forward. So these are some of the areas maybe that we have really affected a lot and in the region, but also just to expand on in terms of how we can move forward, especially learning from the war. You know, we need really to protect food from political conflict. I was part of the UN Food System Summit last year as the youth vice chair for Action Track 5, which we are actually looking in terms of how we can build food systems resilience to vulnerabilities, shocks, and stress. And one of the solutions which we really looked out and which we really stretched much during the UN summit was how we can protect food from political disruption. So you talk of the humanitarian corridors which are blocked, and in some parts, for instance, in the eastern and the western Ukraine, where Russians have bombarded the railway stations. So, and this will also even reduce the amount of food or commodity that would reach to victims in the Ukraine. So maybe as we really move forward through the United Nations, we need to think forward in terms of how we'll be able to protect food from such political conflict, but also just to make food as a universal human right, treating food as medicine. So maybe much as there are a lot of suffering youth, women and children in Ukraine, but this will also tell us in terms of how we can shape especially within our food system moving forward. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Mike. A quick response. What's your own sense of what's happening in Ukraine. The Russian, is there a point of view about what's happening? The invasion? Are you there? I think we may have temporarily. Mike, did you get my question? Yes.
No. Unfortunately, I didn't get your question. Yeah.
Oh, all right. My question is, apart from the food problems, what's your own take about what has happened and what's happening in Ukraine, the Russian invasion?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I think from my own perspective as a young person in my country, and a person who had an opportunity perhaps to represent youth in different international meetings, recent 2 weeks I've been in Kenya, where I've seen the impact of the war in Ukraine in terms of the fuel prices in Kenya. And 2 weeks ago, I was in Zimbabwe, where I also had to appreciate the impact of war in terms of bread and other commodities in Zimbabwe. So my role as young people, and I think I've also emphasized this during our youth meeting, that we really need to urge our government forward, that they really need to speak out, as my colleague from Malaysia said, that much as that we cannot contribute a lot in terms of decision making, but we can be able to really push our government to really voice out in terms of the impact on the war.
So you feel there's a need, you feel there's a need as a young person, you feel there's a need for your countries, just as Eliza said, to speak up and speak out.
Yes, there's a need, and this need is very urgent because the suffering is continuing, and we cannot just watch. There's urgent need to speak out during the UN Council meetings and the like, and even just in our own countries, just to really voice out through media and the like, so that at least we should reduce the suffering that our friends are in place in Ukraine.
Thank you, Mike. Santiago?
Yes.
Do you want to say something? Or do you have a question?
I just want to add, I'm not pro-Russian, but one of my biggest fears, even here 1,000 miles away, we'll have a Russian country that is very well put in a corner. As you guys might know through history, big governments and proud governments that are put in a corner create big conflicts, and that's something that we have seen in the conflict right now. Russian shelling humanitarian aid, humanitarian aid. But at the same time, I don't see Russia right now as corner as many people will think, because this is also a type of strategy in war that they use even in Syria to put pressure on other countries and the country itself to try to give up. So I just want to know your opinion on how do you see a Russia that is very well put in, like is very cornered, as well the international the West is doing right now.
Okay. Panelists, anyone wants to go first? Timur? You're muted, Timur. Sorry.
I was hoping that Galina would come and speak for Ukraine on that issue. But look, the risk of Russia, lashing out further or using a scorched earth strategy, I think in many ways, Santiago is absolutely correct. We have seen that playbook in the past, whether it is in Syria or in Chechnya, or even the earlier incursions in Ukraine as well as in Georgia, that there is a very specific playbook, which is one of an absolute ruthless scorched earth policy to get your opponent to submit. I think that threshold has already been passed, and I think Ukraine is turning out to be, in this juncture, a totally different adversary than anything Russia has encountered in its recent history. I think that the initial blitzkrieg type approach that the Russians thought that they would get away with has proven to be an absolute failure. And the sort of military and financial support Ukraine is getting right now to pursue its defense is, again, without parallel in recent memory. And therefore, the risk, however, is that Russia is, of course, a nuclear power and it can keep on escalating to unthinkable levels. But in terms of just conventional attack and counterattack, I think what the Ukrainian soldiers and strategists have done is just absolutely amazing. And they are being ably supported by their Western allies. No question about that.
Sure, thanks. Galina?
Yeah, thanks for taking that up, Timur. I actually wanted someone else to speak because you can take me as a biased person. So I mean, I'm a Ukrainian, so to me it's like I mean I'm from Ukraine, so I've spent in Ukraine good like almost 30 years of my life, and I've always been in touch. So, and I've seen all the you know, when Russia trying to put up their foot on whatever was going on in Ukraine. So, and then finally, I mean, this is not the first time. In 2014, they've actually invaded the 2 areas and they didn't let go of that for so many years. And this invasion is like full-fledged invasion, which is total atrocity. So how far, how much more can they go? We don't know, but definitely if they're not stopped, they won't stop. So I don't see any way out rather than, you know, make them stop. They have to stop somewhere, because if and the international community the other countries have to realize that if Russia is not stopped now, they will not stop at Ukraine. And all this discourse about, you know, or we were scared of Ukrainians because they wanted to become part of NATO. Come on, Latvia is already part of NATO. You're bordering on them. So, I mean, I don't know. There is no answer to that. And then we have one crazy guy who can, yeah, if his ego is pushed, he can go anywhere. So I don't see, rather than whatever is going on now, I mean, they will flatten Ukraine, and I'm prepared for that. You know, I am to the point that I'm prepared to lose all my family. But Putin will not stop, and he will go further. And if Ukraine surrenders now, this is not gonna solve the problem. It's not. So something has to be done. I mean, first of all, it's they have to understand that they can't win. I mean, Russia can't win simply in this situation. So I don't have an easy answer to this question. And yeah, his ego can be pushed. Putin's ego can be pushed. He can just start shooting everywhere. So that's why there is the danger. Apart from the humanitarian danger and the lack of food and everything, there is also a danger of the open conflict across all countries. Yeah.
Thank you, Galina. Well, we have a question from Dennis Lee in the audience, who wants to raise a slightly different perspective. Dennis, can we have your question, please?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but could you come on vision?
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, Dennis.
Yeah, hi, Mr.
Yes, Dennis.
Thank you for the session and hearing from different views. As I think this is really, I think the key here is to really ask inconvenient questions, and it seems that everybody is looking at it should look at it from different perspectives, and I hope that this is not a panel or a session where everybody is seated on one side, because nobody asks things from the viewpoint of the Russians. Yeah.
Okay. Why don't you go ahead and ask the question?
Yeah. So my point is, from perspective of Russians, you have to ask, right? Why is this so? What led to the invasion in the first place? I mean, there are different people who interpret differently. Dr. Getnier was just mentioning that Russia will not stop here. I beg to differ. I think that if we make these statements, I think it will be substantiated. My point would be that from the Russians' point of view, you have got the Western countries, and especially the US, right, sending military equipment, and it's almost like fighting a proxy war, and the Ukrainians are basically the ones having to do it, you see. So these are all politics, isn't it, at the end of the day? So the question is, my question is, why are we all looking at two issues. One is, oh, we are all suffering from this, and we are, because we are living in a interdependent world, right? And we are feeling the effects. These are downstream issues. The issue is now is that there's two countries that are at war, and it seems that the economic sanctions are not going to hold back the Russians. And when you have two big elephants fighting, the grass suffers, right? So why?
So Dennis, perhaps, yeah, we get your question, we get your point.
Okay.
But I have a question for you,
yeah,
right? Before I put it to the other panelists.
Sure.
If you were a Ukrainian and you were living there, and the Russians have invaded you,
yes,
and they continued to, pummel your various buildings,
yeah,
shoot your people in the kneecap, would you ask the same question?
No,
would you ask?
Not.
No. The question is, if you are Ukrainian, you are there, and this thing happens to you, would you be here asking the same question?
I won't, because I'm not a Ukrainian.
So you have to be a Ukrainian to feel the pain, and nobody else in the world should feel the pain on behalf of the Ukrainians?
No, I don't agree with that. I don't agree.
No. So what exactly is it? See, we are not. You see, I made it very clear at the start of this program. Sure. We are not here. We don't want to spend the next 1.5 hours debating on who is right or who's wrong.
Right.
Because there are so many facets to this. Today, I made it clear that I would like us to focus on the humanitarian aspect of it and the impact of the war on the rest of the world. Right? Okay. Now, it's very evident. For example, there's 37% rise in food prices globally, yes, estimated by the World Bank. And there are many, many other ways in which all of us are affected and will continue to be affected. We just at the tip of the iceberg, right? Yep. So for today's purposes, we'd like to focus, on the humanitarian aid relief, right, at a human level, and also the impact of this on the world. I'm sure we all agree, including yourself, that we all want to see the war end.
Yes.
The suffering to end, and also for the impact on the rest of the world, inflation and stagflation, to also sort of taper off. As long as we agree on that, let's continue with the discussion. Okay. With your permission, Dennis.
Oh, no, don't need my permission. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ben, you have a point to make? You have to unmute yourself. Did you want to say something?
I wanted to add.
Yeah.
Yes, please go ahead.
Me, yeah. Go ahead, Galina.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that this is not two countries at war. In the 2 months of this invasion, the people in the international community would have noticed that Ukraine hasn't shot over the border yet. So Ukraine didn't go offensive on Russia. So this is clearly an invasion. For whatever reason it is, people have their own answers. And everybody now has made their own stance. And we are not there to convince which side to take. But this is not two countries at war. We have to be very, very clear with the definition. War is when two countries are fighting with each other. Right now, Russia is fighting with Ukraine on the Ukrainian territory, bombing and shelling civilians and Ukrainian cities and hospitals and schools. There was no weapons, there was no bombs thrown on any of the Russian cities. And we have to be very clear in this. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, Ben, did you have something to say?
Yep. Very quickly, I think as a humanitarian and from the Red Cross, I don't want to get into the politics of it, but I just want to make the point that Dr. Galina made as well, that at the end of the day, I think as the global community, we all have to be humanitarian. Who are those suffering? In a lopsided kind of way, it is the people of Ukraine who have been displaced, who are in displaced centers outside their country, who have had their hospitals bombed and all that. And as the humanitarian in all of us, I think we need to do our part, because this is really something that the world has come together to help those who are now suffering. And I think that's the point that I want to make. And I have a question on the chat. Wiswa, if you allow me, can I answer the chat?
Yes, you want to
from,
answer the question.
Yeah.
Tong Hai, yes, go ahead.
So just to clarify, when I said we work with the UN and other bodies, I think the concept is that I think this is a crisis, a humanitarian crisis that is so huge that we cannot afford to say that we all work in silos. We really have to come together to see how we can work the best to reach the people who need the help. Singapore Red Cross itself doesn't specifically work with the UN. How we have been bringing our assistance into Ukraine and the neighboring countries has been to work with our sister national societies, both the Ukraine Red Cross as well as Polish Red Cross, Hungarian Red Cross, and the other Red Crosses. But we are also now working with other humanitarian actors, ad hoc humanitarian actors like what I described, working with the Ukrainian Association in Singapore, but also, for example, Singaporeans who are doing their part in Poland and elsewhere. So we have to be flexible. We have to see what works in order to meet the needs on the ground, because the needs are very complex. The situation is very complex.
Right.
Thanks, Wiswa.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to say anything? Yes, Matthias, go ahead.
Yes, I would just like to bring this up about the humanitarian. Yes, of course, Ukrainians need humanitarian help. But I think what's the most important, we can give all the help we have, but I think we should campaign for stop the war. Through my experience here in Ukraine, Ukrainians are very appreciative. The ultimate goal is world peace, stop the war.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying, what I'm appealing to on behalf of the Ukrainian people here, we can have this discussion, but we need to do something. Action must be taken. You know, although you know, every small little bit matters. So if everybody put a petition against Russia, and I believe, you know, there's a will, there's a way.
Yeah.
We can stop the war. You know?
That's precisely the purpose. That's precisely the purpose of this discussion, to raise sufficient awareness, to raise awareness, so that awareness can lead to action, right? And but we'd like to do it in a manner that is intellectually honest, above board. Nobody should be denied the right to articulate their views or perspectives. I hope we all respect that. Pravin from the audience, Pravin Suraj Santakumar, you'd like to say something. You've been wanting to say something for some time. Could we have Pravin, please, on vision? Go ahead to ask the question.
Hi. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Mr. Sadasivam. Actually, I just want to raise my perspective on the three questions that were raised earlier on. One is basically on why Ukraine doesn't surrender to end the war or end the loss of life. I think the nationalistic sentiment among the Ukrainians, I think it's a different level compared to how we compare. We cannot compare it to Singapore. In that sense, because they have gone through smaller wars during these past few years, especially in Donbass and Crimea and all that, and their views and their ideas have been polarized right from very young. So I think that is the sentiment that they've grown to love the country, love the homeland, love their nation as how they have gone through over the years. And to the other question of the take on the Russian invasion, I believe it's not just about expanding NATO territory, NATO expansion, or about the US. It's about expanding Russia's territory. And for all you know, Ukraine is in the middle of all this, basically because at some point of time, Russia is probably going to move into all the other countries. And if they have the power to take over a democratic country, independent country, just like through an invasion, that gives them the right to go for other countries. I mean, we would never know. Like Moldova,
Okay.
Moldova is not a NATO country. And I think the other issue about the impact, how we have it here in Singapore, I think like similar to, I think you might have experienced that a lot of people are saying, you know, how does it impact us here in Singapore? I think it's not a matter of the direct impact, but I think the indirect impact in terms of oil prices, in terms of food, grocery prices, which has been gone up, I think, ever since the start of the war. So I think all this is a consideration factor, and we should not just look at it as a country has been far away and been, you know, fighting the war, but actually with everybody, it's the war against the world. It's not the war against just a country.
Right.
Yeah.
Well put. I need to move on. I'll come back to you all later. I know your hands are up. I feel that this is probably the right time to do a poll. We'd like to do a poll right now with the panelists as well as the participants on Zoom. Unfortunately, we can't include those who are watching this program live stream on YouTube. You will see a pop-up screen with the question in a short while. All you need to do is indicate whether you agree or disagree with the question. It's very easy. We have 15 seconds, 15. The question is this: to end the war, we must be prepared to negotiate with President Putin. Agree or disagree? To end the war, we must be prepared to negotiate with President Putin. Agree or disagree? So you just need to click on the right circle and then submit. All right, can we show the results? So 86% agree that to end the war, we must be prepared to negotiate with Putin. Right. Now, the reason why we chose to put this question is there was a reaction to Secretary General Antonio Guterres' visit to Russia. You know, and people are saying, why validate Russia by actually speaking to them? And we were interested to know whether people feel that at this point in time, it is important to do whatever it takes to bring this war to an end. You know, so that's why we put this question. It's interesting that we had this response. Now, with that, I'd like to move on to ask ourselves, how badly has the war affected Ukraine's economy? Here are some estimates by the World Bank. Can we show the slide, please? So if you look at the GDP, it has gone down by 45.1%. Unharvested crops, 20 to 30%. Economic losses, $83.25 billion in US dollars. Infrastructural damage, 100 billion. Inflation, 13.7% and climbing. And the poverty rate is about 20%. That's what we are facing for Ukraine at this point in time. And the picture is going to get a lot more gloomy. So I guess that's quite clear to us. The impact in terms of the reconstruction efforts, the rebuilding efforts, it's huge, right? Vox Europe, a branch of the Center for Economic Policy Research, highlighted 3 phases in the recovery and reconstruction efforts. Firstly, they said there should be an emergency response, which is what we're talking about right now. Second, restoration of critical infrastructure and services for economic revival. And the third phase would be setting foundations for sustained growth. So I have this question for Ben. Ben, how do the international agencies such as the Red Cross, International Red Cross, work in a coordinated fashion with other agencies and the Ukrainian government? And I believe as well as the various military that will be involved. How is the coordination done? It must be highly complex and complicated.
Okay, Wiswa, I think in any rebuilding effort after a disaster, after a natural disaster, it is complex. And there are many parties that are involved in it. whether it's the Red Cross and other humanitarian organizations, whether it's the government of the day itself, and thirdly, the international organizations like the UN. I think in an effort like Ukraine, which is still a bit down the road because we are really in an emergency phase still, and the emergency phase is going to continue. The Red Cross has actually already started working in some parts of Ukraine to restore some of the basic infrastructure, so like clinics and hospitals and even some bridges. But the real phase of recovery will only start after the conflict stops.
Yeah.
And that is going to be a massive, massive rebuilding job. You can imagine that perhaps the lead agency on this will maybe the World Bank and the UN agencies, with finances coming from governmental sources. They will be the major players in the rebuilding effort.
But you see, Ben, in the meantime, because we don't know when this war is going to end. It could take months, it could take a year, 2 years, we don't know. But in the meantime, there's tremendous amount of help and assistance that's needed on the ground. Medical help, mental health help, as well as, just sustenance, right? Sustenance is also important. People have to survive. So how can international agencies like the Red Cross or other agencies help while the war is going on? Because we can't wait for the war to end, right?
Yes. So as I mentioned, we are still in the emergency phase, recovery phase. A lot of the effort now is going into still supplying the basic needs, shelter, food, water. I think in the next phase, and we are coming into this next phase, but it's still part of the emergency phase, will be to see how we can restore some of the infrastructure in terms of like clinics, hospitals, whether in the display centers around Ukraine or within Ukraine. And then the next, together with this phase, I think more and more people will look at how to bring back education for the children. Education is totally disrupted.
Yes.
You need to bring back psychosocial support for the children, but also for the adults. Yeah. And then you got to put in place a network to take care of those who are chronically ill, those with diabetes, those who need the medicine supplies and all that. Now, that in itself is a massive effort. The Red Cross will play a big role in it. We will work with our partners in the national societies in the ground. But there are other players like the UN, the World Health Organization, the World Food Program will play their part as well. Now, on the ground, we all coordinate to ensure that there's that the needs are the assistance is not concentrated in one place and parts that are missed out. We do our own thing, but we work together. The UN depends a lot on funding from government sources. Now, people have to understand that each Red Cross is an independent organization.
Yeah.
So Red Crosses have funding from different sources. Some Red Crosses have a lot of funding from government sources, like their aid programs. In the case of Singapore, we have launched a public appeal. Yeah. I'm glad to say that besides the 100,000 USD that came from the government, we have collected $7 million from the members of the public. So I think each Red Cross brings different strengths. I understand the American Red Cross has raised about $12 million from their public appeal.
Right.
So these resources have to come together. I think this is one area where you talk about the billion coalition for resilience will come into play. Not only the humanitarian organization, the government bodies, but eventually even the corporate sector will have to play a role.
Absolutely. So
even in this space,
funding. You brought up funding. Funding is so important, right? So the EU has already announced the Ukraine Solidarity Trust Fund.
Yes.
The EU has announced over 20 billion euros in funding for countries hosting the Ukrainian refugees, countries such as Poland, Slovakia, Czechia, and Moldova. The World Bank has mobilized $3 billion, just announced, right, for Ukraine, $3 billion to carry on with essential government services during the war. Also, an additional $1.5 billion for immediate humanitarian. We're talking billions and billions of dollars. The IMF estimates that Ukraine would need $5 billion per month to offset the damage to the economy and infrastructure. $5 billion per month that the Ukrainian World Congress, or UWC, that represents 20 million strong, the 20 million strong diaspora across 60 countries. It has raised $18 million for Ukrainian humanitarian and war efforts. And there's also this delicate matter of war compensation. And Timur, I'd like your inputs on this. According to the international law, Ukraine can ask Russia for compensation. It's been suggested that frozen Russian assets and funds could be released for these purposes. Is that possible? Is that even legal?
So, Vishwa, I'm going to come to that momentarily. Just wanted to touch on one point that Benjamin was making, that sort of global coordination is imperative. Post-war reconstruction is not a new thing. It's not novel. We have been doing it for the last century. From Marshall Plan onwards, global bodies have come together, superpowers have come together to finance the reconstruction of war-ravaged economies repeatedly, from the UN to the EBRD, which stands for European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. There are organizations whose raison d'etre is to help with post-conflict reconstruction. So it can be done, it will be done. There is a lot of alignment and goodwill for Ukraine. So when this conflict ends, you will see the mother of all construction and reconstruction projects take place in Ukraine, and Ukraine will come out of it. No question about that. But that is about the economic damage. I've already posted on the chat site a couple of relevant numbers just to give everybody sense of the scale. Ukraine is not a very large economy. Ukraine is not a very rich economy. Its per capita income is somewhere in the range of Indonesia's. Its GDP is about 45% of that of Singapore. So no matter what is destroyed during the course of the wherewithal to fix it is certainly going to be there. It is not that daunting, especially if the entire EU is behind it. Now, that is about the economic damage. But what about beyond economic damage? What about, as you pointed out, reparations or seeking redress? That's a more complicated issue, although in recent years, the US has been very, very aggressive in this regard as well. Some of you may know that ever since the Iranian hostage crisis in 1979, huge amount of Iranian assets were frozen by the Americans, and some of it only got released during the final year of Obama administration when there was a nuclear deal done. The Afghan government, the central bank, had about $7.5 billion of its reserves frozen by the US government last year after the US withdrew from Afghanistan, and half of that the US, rather provocatively, has actually earmarked for 9/11 victims. I've seen a lot of negative press around that you are sort of punishing Afghanistan for crimes it's yet to commit. It is being punished for crimes it may commit because the Taliban only got into power last year, and already such punitive measures have been taken. But once precedents like that have been set, subsequent crises lead to taking a page out of those playbooks, and we've already seen over $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves are not usable, meaning they are stuck in various central bank accounts, whether it is in Bank of England or ECB or the Federal Reserve. Now, freezing it is one thing. Seizing it is a whole different ballgame. And it would be extremely provocative. And Russia might see it as an extremely strong red line being crossed. I think somebody in the chat already mentioned that, is the West fighting a proxy war through Ukraine against Russia? Well, seizing Russian assets, Russian government assets, we're not talking about oligarch assets, we're talking about Russian government assets, would be passing a bit of a Rubicon, if you will. So I would see that as major escalation in the ongoing conflict. A lot of escalation has taken place already, but that would be going on a whole different level.
Right. Extremely useful what you just said, because and we are not dealing with Afghanistan, we are dealing with Russia.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. The two separate things. And also, funding is likely to come fast and furious from multiple directions, unregulated, non-institutional channels, to civil society groups as well. And there are certain risks involved here. Am I right, Timur?
Yes. Again, the issues go both ways, Vishwa. So one, let me just step back for a second and talk about the sanctions' secondary impact. So today, banks cannot deal with Russian banks, or most Russian banks. Some Russian banks can still deal with the SWIFT network, but most can't. And if you did, you'd be subject to some degree of sanctions. Now, if you're not part of the SWIFT network, so let's say you're a Chinese bank, technically speaking, you can go ahead and engage the Russians without any risk, unless the Western nations come together and say there are secondary, sanctions, just the way, wide range of Western banks were subject to secondary sanctions for dealing with Iran through backdoor manners. And once they got caught, they were subject to a massive amount of penalties. Would the West be that aggressive as to start sanctioning Chinese and Indian entities for dealing with Russia while circumventing the SWIFT sanctions? So far, I see no indications of that, but I do see in the civil societies in the US pressure for the US government to start imposing secondary sanctions for entities circumventing these sanctions. So mind you, a lot of these sanctions, or rather all of these sanctions, are bilateral. These are not UN sanctions. Hence, for the US to start imposing secondary, which it has done in the past, is a bit of an overreach, has not been seen kindly by other countries in the past. Now, the other way, which is countries and entities that are trying to help Ukraine, would they get in trouble with Russia? Well, I guess, everybody's eyes are wide open. Everybody knows who's taking which side on this conflict. And I'm sure if the Russians can, they will try to penalize countries and entities that try to do it. We saw this play out yesterday when Romania and I believe Bulgaria saw their gas supply getting cut off by the Russians because the Russians are demanding ruble payment, and the EU is already telling all the countries don't do it. Although I don't really see why the EU would care, because anybody who understands basic international finance would know it doesn't really matter whether you pay by ruble or dollars. From a financial flow perspective, it's all the same. It's a wash. Depends on where at which point it gets converted. But no, I'm sure the Russians are not forgiving either, and they will try to take numbers of those who are helping. But at this point, I think the balance of power has shifted. Global body is very much on Ukraine's side.
Right. And talking about civil society, civil society has been extremely active in Ukraine right from 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea, and were instrumental. Civil society groups were instrumental in the overthrow of the then pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych. It has demonstrated, the civil society groups in Ukraine, the propensity as well as the capacity of citizens to organize themselves. Now, during this war, students, teachers, and others have directly and indirectly aided the Ukrainian resistance movements. So I'd like to put this question to Galina and Matthias. What are your observations about the power and the potency of civil society groups, especially the youth? Galina, you are muted. Yeah.
Ukrainians have shown the great capacity in organizing themselves, especially in the face of the upcoming real danger. So what is going on now in Ukraine? There is a huge movement of volunteers. Volunteers basically for everything, absolutely everything. That is starting from the volunteers are collecting money. It's now the weapons started coming from other countries, but in the very beginning, we could only deal with what was there on the ground in Ukraine at that point in time, and the volunteers movement. So the volunteers immediately stood up, and this is not something new for the people. There was volunteers movement. There was a ongoing war since 2014. So the invasion was there for 8 years, just on a smaller scale. So there were people who were constantly in touch with the soldiers on the ground there. So they've had their channels of collecting the money and sending the weapons. So they've just started doing that on a massive scale. Secondly, help on the humanitarian, on the humanitarian front. From the very first few days, they started bombing everywhere in every city, and especially I think Kharkiv was the one who got it the most in the first few weeks. So we ended up with, in the first 2 weeks of the invasion, Ukraine ended up with almost 2 to 3 million of internally displaced people already. So apart from those who were fleeing overseas, there was a lot of internally displaced. So I am the participant and also the diaspora, all the Ukrainians who live overseas, including people like me who live in Singapore for many years. So we have Canada, we have Australia, unfortunately, throughout the history, Ukrainians, not for the good reasons, not because of their professionals going somewhere, just the same as now, they had to flee Ukraine after the Second World War, even long before that. So we have huge diaspora in different countries. So everybody just get organized, and how it works, I don't know. I can't tell you, but when you see other people doing something, then all of you just try to help. So this is how it works. I don't know how it works, but this is the spirit, and we know that if we don't help ourselves, nobody is going to help us. So even now, when the people are going to overseas, like they're fleeing the country, they are still going there looking for jobs to work. They don't want to be a burden to someone. They are waiting to come back to Ukraine. Also, internally displaced people in Ukraine, many of them came back to the cities which were freed, which is Irpin, Bucha, even now Bucha and Kyiv, definitely. So the humanitarian help was there. So, like, for example, I'm the member of some of the groups in Ukraine on the ground in my native city. So if we hear anybody gives any information to our group here in Singapore that, look, the lady from Lysychansk, which is Luhansk region, she lost her home and she moved to Vinnytsia, for example, which is my city. So I immediately send the information on the groups in Vinnytsia asking anybody can help, please message her in private or message me. So this kind of chain is there. This kind of invisible support is always there. And also this huge demand for, like Benjamin said earlier, for the psychological support. So from day one, we started working on the people, on finding the people who could render, psychological help. So we have the volunteers who are working with the people on the ground. Even the people like me who live overseas, we are secondary victims also. So there was a lot of huge psychological, going through unrest, uncertainty in our minds. There was depressions for many people, but we can't even imagine what's going on there in Ukraine. So all these.
Right. So I have a question. When you talk about civil society groups, especially when they're as active as you've just suggested, and you, from what you're saying, it's not just the civil society groups within Ukraine, but also the diaspora, right? People like you. It's very, very powerful. I guess my question for all the panelists is this: when these civil society groups become empowered, in fact, possibly even emboldened after the war, and there would be an expectation on their part to play a significant role in the rebuilding process. Now, how will the Ukrainian government and the international organizations, as well as peace-building institutions and NGOs like the Red Cross, work together with civil society movements, especially the youths, to ensure a desirable outcome? The reason why I'm asking this is very often in war-torn situations, this becomes a problem area, because during the war, certain groups take charge and take ownership of the situation and feel empowered and emboldened. And then after the war, sometimes they feel sidelined, and then you have tremendous problems in society. We saw this happening actually, the rebuilding in the rebuilding process in Bosnia-Herzegovina. We saw it happening in Rwanda. We saw it happening in Cambodia. All are high-profile, high-visibility war situations. So I'd like a good quick comment from before we wind up the discussion, please.
From me or from Benjamin?
Anyone. Ben, maybe you can start with you.
Okay, perhaps I can start. I think as I mentioned earlier, I think the rebuilding process is going to be a very complex one. And you correctly point out that people who have stepped out to
and
help
invested.
out in the invested in the response will also want to have a say in the rebuilding process. I am cautiously optimistic about the situation in Ukraine. I tell you why, because as opposed to some of the other examples that you just pointed out, right? I think there's a fair amount of unanimity among the Ukrainian diaspora as well as the Ukrainian people. I mean, there's no hard and fast break in the society. So I think there will be a certain amount of unity. I'm cautiously optimistic. And
so
secondly,
that's, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. Secondly, I think there will be a huge demand for resources. yes, the World Bank will come on board. Yes, the European Bank of Reconstruction will come on board. But I think there will be a huge demand for resources which the Ukrainian diaspora will be able to play a part in responding. And I think, therefore, you will have a seat on the table in the rebuilding. So I'm cautiously optimistic that in this case, the diaspora who has responded so tremendously, and we see many of them working on the ground, will be able to play a meaningful role in the rebuilding once that gets going. Yeah.
Thank you. Timo, a quick comment from you, your final comment. You are muted, sorry.
I just wanted to make one point that, in my travels through Ukraine, I've realized that, that the Polish people and the Ukrainian people are kindred spirit. They share a lot of history, a lot of culture. And now that Poland has sort of opened with its open arm, brought in hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Ukrainian immigrants, for the time being, it's actually a great macroeconomic solution for the tight labor market that Poland had. Ukraine brings with it, tremendous skills, tremendous expertise, tremendous work ethic, and their tragedy, in a very strange way, will bring the Ukrainian and Poles together. And at least from a livelihood perspective, those from Ukraine and crossing borders into Poland will be able to find sustenance. And I mean, I take Galina's point that Ukrainians are keen to go back to their country and rebuild. But at the same time, those who do not, I think, would contribute tremendously, whether it is the United States or Europe's economic dynamism for decades to come.
Thank you. Note of optimism. Thank you. I'd like to have a quick comment, very quick, short comment from each of our youth panelists. Santiago, let's start with you. A quick comment.
At this moment, I'm just on the background listening. I don't have a comment. I just actually have a question, but I think it's gonna have a very big answer. So already know asking it. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have a wish for Ukraine?
Yes. I mean, even Ukraine and even other countries in the world, this is something that shouldn't happen to anybody. No one should go through this. And I mean, we're all in this together. So the best we can do is try to mediate and resolve any conflicts and try to help us as better as possible in humanitarian, economically, in many, many sectors.
Thank you. Thank you. Mike?
So I think
Sorry, we lost you again, Mike.
Yeah, so my quick comments from my side would be that I would urge my Korean people, wherever we are coming from, that perhaps we need to remain united. The way we have campaigned for climate change, the way we campaign for malnutrition and food insecurity, we can also do the same to campaign for peace in Ukraine. And let us help each other in terms of dealing with misinformation, which is on the social media. So we can also help on that because there's a lot of misleading information on social media. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Eliza.
For me, I think it's rather unfortunate that we have to see a war emerge, a crisis to emerge, for us to understand the sentiments of people half across the world, I would say. So I think with this being said, I think goes back to the last question also, youth plays a very integral role. So be it like, for me, instance, in Malaysia or like other people from other parts of the world, we need to be a global citizen. So whenever we see injustice, we need to fight and correct all of this wrongdoing. So I personally understand there are limitations to what we can do, but that does not mean we cannot do anything. There are things that we should do. And I think with the advancements of technology, we have social media, be it TikTok, Twitter, and more, we can definitely reach out from there and lend a hand to one and another. So I think just a message to those Ukrainians, I would say, don't ever feel that this fight will ever be end in a very bad way. I understand there are losses, but please never give up, because all of us will be with you and we'll try our best to help and accommodate you in our capacity. So yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Hope. Hope is so important. I'd like to give the last word to our man in Ukraine, Matthias. and I'm sure you have emotions and feelings about everything that you heard so far. And we'll give the very last word to our Ukrainian representative here, Galina, right? So Matthias, over to you.
Yes. Too many people, I've seen too many deaths here, too much sufferings. Although, you know, I'm here as an eyewitness through my photos. I get deeply affected as well. So what my message is, give peace a chance. And people out here, Ukrainians, are suffering is just unbearable. I mean, I witnessed firsthand, and just seeing them going through is it's just words cannot express. And I just hope that we will come to our senses with humanity. I think that's very important in life. You know, I think the world deserves a better world.
And you don't need to be Ukrainian.
You don't have to be Ukrainian, because this is all about humanity.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter who you are, what race you are. It's all about humanity.
Right. Thank you, Matthias. And thank you for making time to talk to us from Ukraine. And you're doing a wonderful job. Those pictures are powerful. Thank you. Galina, you've got the last word. And Tong Hai from the audience has been asking to hear what you want the world to do for you. What do you want us to do? What's your final message for us?
Thank you very much to everyone, to the organizers, to the panelists, and to the participants. And thank you to you, Matthias, that you have taken, you know, this step and went actually there. And you are the only person who is right now in Ukraine seeing all this. So I would say that we need the world to be together, and we need to be humans. We don't need to divide ourselves into races, colors, see anything else, our differences. At this point in time, we have to see our similarities, that we're all humans, you know. And I agree with you, Matthias, that yeah, we don't need to be a Ukrainian to understand the pain and to see the pain. So as I see the help to Ukraine at the moment, there would be 3 directions in the humanitarian kind of like area. So first of all, this is what Matthias is already doing. I mean, we don't have to go to Ukraine now if we can't, or we don't have to go there and witness what Matthias is doing as exceptional and outstanding. But raising awareness, being critical with the information we receive, you know, operating on the ground of principles and values, human values, the value for life, the value for fairness, you know, we should not be questioning the fact that, you know, whoever is attacking first is wrong. So these are the basic principles, basic values which we have been taught in school, we have been taught by our parents. So such things should be, you know, in place, and then we should act based on those values and raise awareness about what's going on, because this is not the war of Ukraine against fighting Ukraine against Russia. This is now what is happening. There is just, let's say, we don't put the names. It's one country which is trying to fight for freedom, for values, for freedom of choice, and for independence, for sovereignty. You know, so it could be any country. If not Ukraine, it could have been any other country. So we should not forget about that. So I think raising awareness and proper information, and be critical with what we distribute on social media and to others, and fakes and all that, is very, very important. Because more than weapons, more than food, more than water, we need to be, honor is important, you know. So this is one thing. Number 2 is that there is a humanitarian drive going on. So if you have the capacity, yes, donate for the humanitarian causes and needs, to the Red Cross, to UNHCR for the refugees, whatever you can. And the third one, I think that's more specific, that is the help psychological help. So even if you are not a professional, even if you're not a psychologist, even if you're not a counselor or whoever, just giving a human, approach to those people who need that is very important. Standing with you, showing that you understand the plight, understand the grief, and understand the kind of things which are happening right now.
Thank you, Galina. And I'm sure your message rings well for all of us, and I think the key point is it's not about who is right, who's wrong. I think we have to go beyond that. We kind of know what is right and wrong. What's important is let's get down to helping the people who need the help, and not be distracted. And with that, I'd like to say a big thank you to my 4 panel speakers, Galina, Timur, Ben, and Matthias, as well as our youth voices, Eliza, Santiago, and Mike. And my special thanks to the rest of you for making time to join us. There's been several wars in my lifetime. I felt sorry for the people affected, but was not too affected, possibly because they were happening thousands of miles away. But somehow, this war in Ukraine has been different, even though it's happening so far away. I don't think it is because the media, especially the Western media, is talking about it every day. First, because I know it's going to have an impact on my livelihood, spiraling energy and commodity prices and inflation. Second, because it's an unjustified invasion by a large country of a smaller sovereign country, similar to my country, Singapore. Third, and very importantly, because it's tearing up the world, is pulling us in different directions, into camps and pushing us to take sides. There are forces that are oversimplifying the matter and making it a binary equation. The Russia-China camp versus the free world led by the USA. I'm seeing otherwise sensible people subscribing to and vehemently advocating a "you are with me or against me" stance. To me, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the resulting death and devastation is wrongful and must be accounted for. But that does not mean, however, that the USA, NATO, or other countries are absolutely right in everything we did and continue to do in this context. I'm deeply troubled that there are people who even suggest, right, that it is wrong for us to have an alternative peacemaking approach for the sake of the lives and the livelihood of the Ukrainian people. And when we make such a statement, we are rebuffed as being weak and unprincipled. Now, this is the question that bugs me. Should the rage to punish President Putin override the desire to want the war to end and for life to start returning to normal for our Ukrainian brothers and sisters? The two are not the same. I leave you with that thought. This was Inconvenient Questions, where ideas awaken.